The percussive thump of rotor blades shattered the morning silence over the Central Highlands. Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Hu An, commander of the 33rd Regiment, People's Army of Vietnam, lowered his field glasses and allowed himself a thin smile. The Americans were coming, not by truck convoy along Route 19 where mines and ambushes waited, but in those clumsy flying machines that announced their arrival from kilometers away. His men called them sky horses, noisy, vulnerable, dependent on open ground to land. Perfect targets. What Lieutenant Colonel An didn't know on that November morning in 1965 was that he was about to witness the transformation of warfare itself. Within hours, the tactical assumptions that had served the People's Army so well against the French and against American advisors throughout the early war would be shattered by a new doctrine that moved not at the speed of marching feet, but at the speed of turbine engines. The helicopter, which communist forces had dismissed as an expensive American gimmick, was about to demonstrate that it could deliver an entire battalion into the heart of enemy territory in less time than it took to boil rice. The jungle clearing that would become Landing Zone X-ray measured barely 200 to 300 meters across, a scratch in the elephant grass surrounded by triple canopy forest in the Ia Drang Valley. To Piavan commanders observing from concealed positions, it seemed an absurd place for the Americans to land. No defensible high ground, no water source, no road access for resupply or retreat. The clearing sat less than 300 meters from fortified North Vietnamese positions, so close that An's forward observers could hear American radio chatter through the trees. They were walking into a killing zone. Before we go further, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? Drop a comment below, and if you're finding this story as fascinating as we did researching it, hit that like button and subscribe. We dig deep into forgotten moments that changed history. The first UH-1 Huey touched down at 10:48 hours on November 14, 1965. Its skids barely kissed the red laterite earth before 11 combat-equipped soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry poured out, weapons up, fanning into defensive positions. The rotor downwash bent the elephant grass flat and raised clouds of crimson dust that tasted metallic on soldiers' tongues, a gritty mineral flavor that would become the signature sensation of every hot landing zone in Vietnam. Within seconds, the Huey lifted off, its turbine howling under the strain, and another slick dropped into the maelstrom. Then another. The mathematics of air mobility were ruthless and elegant. A typical UH-1 hotel model could carry roughly 11 to 14 troops, though in the hot, high conditions of the Central Highlands, 6 to 8. Combat-loaded Americans was more realistic. A full assault package used 6 to 10 transport helicopters, slicks in pilot parlance, escorted by gunships mounting miniguns, 2.75-inch rocket pods, and door-mounted M60 machine guns. What would have taken a battalion 8 to 12 hours to march through jungle trails, the helicopters accomplished in 30 minutes. Lieutenant Colonel Harold G. Moore, commander of 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, stood in the door of his command, Huey watching his soldiers disappear into the grass. He'd trained for this moment at Fort Benning just months earlier. Hot landing zone drills, immediate perimeter defense, coordinating artillery observers with airborne forward controllers. The doctrine was untested in major combat. The 11th Air Assault Division had been converted into the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, only months before deployment to Vietnam. Moore's battalion was writing the manual in real time, with blood and dust. The smell hit evacuees before they fully processed what they were seeing. The hot, metallic tang of spent cordite mixing with diesel fumes from damaged aircraft. underlaid by something organic and terrible that medics would later identify as battlefield trauma. The tree line erupted with AK-47 fire, the distinctive wet crack of Kalashnikov rifles, answered by the deeper thunder of M16s. Gunship door gunners raked the jungle canopy, tracer rounds drawing orange lines through the morning haze. The Piavan commanders, watching from concealed bunkers 2 to 3 meters deep in the laterite hillside, saw something that contradicted their understanding of American warfare. These weren't advisors. This wasn't a cautious probe along established roads. This was an entire battalion materializing from the sky, combat-ready, with artillery support being called in before the last helicopter cleared the landing zone. The sky had become an avenue of attack. Communist forces had mocked the helicopter since American advisors first began using them for command and reconnaissance in the early 1960s. Viet Cong propaganda leaflets ridiculed Americans for depending on noisy, fuel-hungry machines that couldn't hide, couldn't fight in monsoon weather, and turned pilots into predictable targets during the vulnerable seconds of landing and takeoff. In countless jungle ambushes, VC units had learned that helicopters had to slow, hover, and expose themselves to deliver or extract troops. They were loud. They were obvious. They were supposed to be easy to kill. But what was happening at Landing Zone X-Ray didn't match the script. Major Bruce Crandall, piloting one of the lead Hueys, would fly 22 combat sorties over the next 14 hours, landing repeatedly under direct fire to deliver ammunition and evacuate wounded. His aircraft took hits. Other pilots were shot down. Yet the helicopters kept coming, a rotating shuttle of turbine-driven determination that Vietnamese forces couldn't stop and couldn't escape. The tactical equation had changed. By mid-1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson's escalation policy had shifted American involvement from advisory roles to major combat deployments. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, passed just a year earlier in 1964, had given the president broad authority to prevent South Vietnam's collapse. Into this expanding war came the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, 16,000 soldiers organized around an entirely new concept. They called it air mobility, moving entire battalions by helicopter, then supporting them with rapid artillery displacement and close air support. The doctrine borrowed its name and philosophy from 19th century cavalry: reconnaissance, rapid concentration of force, shock action, but executed from rotorcraft instead of horses or armored vehicles. The nickname stuck: AirCav. As the battle at Landing Zone X-Ray intensified, Piavan regular forces from the 33rd and 66th Regiments began massing for counterattack. These weren't guerrillas. These were uniformed soldiers of the North Vietnamese Army, veterans of campaigns against the French, armed with modern weapons and organized into conventional military formations. They'd come south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, expecting to destroy Army of the Republic of Vietnam units through superior numbers and tactical surprise. Instead, they found themselves fighting an enemy that could redeploy faster than they could march. Lieutenant Colonel An watched as American reinforcements arrived by air within hours of the initial contact. Artillery batteries were airlifted into position by CH-47 Chinook helicopters, twin-rotor cargo birds that could move howitzer tubes, ammunition pallets, and gun crews in single loads. Forward air controllers circled overhead, directing jet strikes onto PAVN assembly areas identified through prisoner interrogations and radio intercepts. The tempo was overwhelming. The Americans were fighting at helicopter speed. But there was a terrible cost being written in the red dirt of the Central Highlands. American casualties mounted as Piavan forces pressed attacks against the hastily established perimeter. Soldiers who'd stepped off helicopters that morning found themselves in close combat by afternoon, wrestling in the elephant grass, calling artillery danger close to their own positions, watching friends die meters away. The helicopters that had delivered them to battle became their lifeline for ammunition, water, and evacuation of wounded. Medevac Hueys, with prominent red crosses painted on white squares, landed under fire to collect the wounded. Before helicopters, injured soldiers might take hours or days to reach surgical care, if they survived that long. In Vietnam, a medevac bird could reach a casualty within 15 to 45 minutes of a call, raising survival odds dramatically when landing zones were secure. Pilots removed helmets after rescue runs to rinse blood from cabin floors with water buckets, a visceral ritual repeated across hundreds of missions. The question Vietnamese commanders now faced was stark. How do you fight an enemy that can be anywhere within helicopter range in less than an hour? And the Americans had more than 7,000 Hueys in country. The Battle of Ia Drang was entering its second day, and neither side yet understood that this remote jungle clearing was defining the character of an entire war. For the Americans, it would prove that Airmobile doctrine could work, that vertical envelopment and rapid reaction could offset enemy numerical advantages. For the North Vietnamese, it demonstrated that accepting mass casualties for tactical objectives could blunt even the most technologically advanced opponent. Both sides would claim validation. Both sides would pay in blood for the lesson. But first, the helicopters had to survive the storm being prepared in the jungle darkness, where PAV and soldiers sharpened stakes, positioned command-detonated mines in likely landing zones, and sighted heavy machine guns to deny the Americans their greatest advantage. The sky was about to become contested airspace. The night of November 14th brought an eerie quiet to landing zone X-ray, punctuated only by the distant rumble of B-52 strikes and the occasional crack of sniper fire. In the darkness beyond the American perimeter, PAV soldiers moved with practiced silence through the underbrush, dragging Chinese DH-10 directional mines into position. They were learning fast. The initial contempt for American helicopters was evaporating with each medevac run that successfully extracted wounded despite concentrated fire. What communist commanders now understood, and what would reshape their tactics for the remainder of the war, was that the helicopter wasn't just a transport vehicle. It was a weapons system that compressed time itself, turning strategic depth into a liability. An enemy force 20 kilometers away could be on top of you in 12 minutes. Artillery batteries that should have taken days to emplace were operational within hours. Wounded soldiers who should have bled out in the jungle were in surgery before sunset. The helicopter had to be stopped. Captain Nguyen Than Puong, a PAVN engineer who survived the Ia Drang campaign, later described the tactical shift in an interview with Vietnamese military historians. We stopped treating helicopters as individual targets and started viewing landing zones as kill boxes. If we couldn't shoot down every helicopter, we could make the ground itself deadly. The technique was brutally simple. Identify likely landing zones, any clearing large enough for multiple aircraft, then seed them with command-detonated explosives, punjai stakes concealed in grass, and tripwires connected to grenades buried in the laterite soil. The rotor downwash would do the rest. When a Huey descended, its blades generated tremendous ground effect, wind speeds exceeding 60 kilometers per hour that bent vegetation flat and raised blinding clouds of dust. That same wind would trigger camouflaged booby traps, snap tripwires taut, or expose the glint of wire to alert defenders. Worse, the dust itself became a weapon. Red laterite particles hung in the air like a crimson fog, obscuring gunners' vision, coating carbines until they jammed, and, most critically, getting sucked into engine intakes, where abrasive grit shortened turbine life and occasionally caused catastrophic failures during extraction. Pilots called it eating dirt. Mechanics called it a maintenance nightmare. By the war's peak, more than 7,000 Hueys flew combat missions in Vietnam out of over 16,000 UH-1s produced overall. Roughly 2,500 UH-1 family helicopters were lost during the conflict, a combination of combat damage and accidents, though the distinction often blurred when an aircraft damaged by ground fire crashed during an emergency landing. The attrition rate forced American logistics into a perpetual sprint. Helicopters needed rotor head inspections, carburetor cleaning, and transmission checks every 100 to 200 flight hours in forward areas. Some birds required engine overhauls after just months in country. The machines were being consumed by the war as surely as the men who flew them. Major Bruce Crandall's 22 sorties on November 14th represented not just extraordinary courage, but extraordinary mechanical stress. Each landing at X-ray meant descending into a maelstrom of small arms fire, the wet crack of AK rounds punching through aluminum skin, the metallic ping of bullets ricocheting off turbine housings. His Huey, like dozens of others in the shuttle, took multiple hits. Hydraulic fluid leaked, instruments flickered, control surfaces responded sluggishly. Yet Crandall kept flying because the men on the ground had no other lifeline. The helicopter crews knew something the strategists in Saigon were still learning. Air mobility created dependency as surely as it created capability. When weather-grounded helicopters and Central Highlands monsoons could arrive with apocalyptic suddenness, isolated units became vulnerable. When anti-aircraft fire grew too intense, commanders faced impossible choices: risk more aircraft and crews, or leave ground forces without resupply. The PAVN learned to exploit these moments, timing attacks for late afternoon when dust and low sun degraded pilot visibility, or during monsoon squalls when helicopters couldn't fly at all. Tactical surprise cut both ways. The soundscape of a hot landing zone became a language pilots learned to read. The high mechanical thrum of healthy turbines versus the grinding howl that meant damage. The sharp crack of small arms versus the deeper boom of 12.7mm heavy machine guns that could shred a helicopter's tail boom. The wet thump of rounds hitting human bodies versus the metallic ping of strikes on airframe. Radio chatter clipped and professional, "Taking fire, 3 o'clock," versus the panicked screaming that meant a bird was going down. UPI reporter Joe Galloway, embedded with Moore's battalion, stepped off a Huey on November 15th into what he later described as hell on earth: red dirt, knee-high elephant grass, and men collapsed covered in blood and soot. The sensory assault was total. The chemical reek of white phosphorus from airstrikes mixing with the copper smell of blood. The tactile sensation of spent brass casings ankle-deep in some positions. The visual shock of seeing magazines, boots, and human shapes scattered where artillery had caught PAVN forces in the open. Galloway, a journalist, not a soldier, found himself carrying wounded under fire because there were no other hands available. War erased civilian distinctions quickly. The PAVN response to Airmobile assault evolved with desperate ingenuity. If helicopters landed in predictable clearings, cut new clearings in unexpected locations. If Americans favored dawn insertions when cool air provided better lift, prepare night ambushes for arriving troops disoriented in darkness. If medevac birds were vulnerable during extraction, concentrate fire on aircraft weighted down with wounded, a war crime by any measure, but increasingly common as frustration mounted. The most effective counter, however, was simply numbers and willingness to accept casualties. Lieutenant Colonel An's forces at Ia Drang ultimately numbered between 1,600 and 2,000 PAVN regulars against roughly 1,000 Americans. The communist strategy was to mass forces rapidly, close to hand grenade range to negate American artillery superiority, and accept horrific losses in exchange for inflicting maximum casualties. The calculation was coldly political. American public opinion wouldn't tolerate body bags, while the North could sustain losses indefinitely. Every helicopter that landed carrying fresh troops also represented a potential propaganda victory if it could be shot down or forced to abandon men on the ground. The mathematics of attrition favored the side with less to lose. On November 15th, as fighting intensified, the true vulnerability of Airmobile operations became apparent at Landing Zone Albany, 6 kilometers north of X-Ray. Another battalion moving overland to reinforce Moore's position was ambushed by PAVN forces in dense jungle. Without the open ground necessary for helicopter support, cut off from effective artillery fire by triple canopy forest, the American unit suffered devastating casualties, roughly 60 killed and 75 wounded in a matter of hours. The helicopters that had seemed invincible at X-Ray couldn't help. The trees were too thick, the clearings too small, the enemy too close. Air mobility had limits written in blood and jungle canopy. What American soldiers discovered, and what Vietnamese fighters exploited, was that the helicopter's greatest strength created predictable patterns. Insertions required clearings. Clearings were finite and mappable. If you couldn't stop the helicopters in flight, you could prepare the ground where they had to land. Viet Cong sappers became experts at estimating rotor disc diameter and calculating blast radius. They'd cut vegetation to create tempting landing zones, then wire them with daisy-chained explosives designed to detonate when the first skid touched Earth. Some landing zones were traps from the moment they were cut. Yet despite mounting losses, the Airmobile concept proved its worth through sheer operational tempo. On November 16th, reinforcements, artillery ammunition, medical supplies, and even hot meals arrived at X-Ray by helicopter, maintaining an isolated battalion deep in enemy territory for 3 days straight. The PAVN forces couldn't match this logistical throughput. Their supplies came by foot along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, carried in 100-pound loads by porters who walked for weeks. Their wounded were dragged back to aid stations kilometers away with minimal medical care. The Americans flew in ice cream containers and beer pallets. This disparity didn't escape Vietnamese fighters' attention. A common conversation in PAVN units after Ia Drang, according to post-war interviews, centered on a disturbing question. How do you defeat an enemy with unlimited resources? The helicopters themselves became symbols of an existential imbalance, mechanical proof that America's industrial capacity was simply beyond competition. For soldiers subsisting on rice, cassava, and salted shrimp paste, watching helicopters deliver steaks and ice cream to besieged positions was psychologically devastating. The war wasn't just about tactics. It was about two civilizations with fundamentally different capacities colliding in the jungle. But the collision was extracting a price from both sides that policymakers in Hanoi and Washington were only beginning to calculate. At X-Ray, the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry suffered roughly 79 killed and 121 wounded in 3 days of combat. Combined with the Albany ambush casualties, the American death toll for the Ia Drang campaign exceeded 230, a shock that rippled through Pentagon briefing rooms and evening news broadcasts. The PAVN losses were catastrophically higher. Estimates ranged from 800 to 1,200 killed. But communist leadership viewed casualties through a different lens. They could afford to lose. The question becoming apparent to both sides was whether the Americans could afford to win this way, trading superior technology and firepower for an enemy's willingness to die by the thousands. The helicopter had changed tactics, but it hadn't changed the strategic equation. For every successful Airmobile insertion, the POV learned. They positioned heavier anti-aircraft weapons. They improved camouflage discipline. They accepted that they'd lose every conventional engagement while calculating that American will would break before communist resolve. Ia Drang proved both sides right. The air cavalry had won the battle decisively, holding landing zones, inflicting disproportionate casualties, and extracting intact. But the PAVN had proven they could stand and fight against American technology without collapse, that they could inflict enough casualties to make victory expensive, and that time favored whoever could endure longer. The helicopters would keep flying, the casualties would keep mounting, and the war had barely begun. The smell of a forward surgical hospital near Pleiku in late November 1965 was unforgettable. A nauseating cocktail of antiseptic, blood, aviation fuel, and something sweetly rotten that medics recognized as infected tissue. Wounded men arrived on stretchers still coated in red laterite mud, their fatigues stiff with dried blood, boots ground down to expose toes from days of combat. They came by helicopter, sometimes within an hour of being hit. This was the revolution that nobody had anticipated. Not just tactical mobility, but medical survivability at scales previously impossible. Before rotary wing medevac, a soldier wounded in dense jungle might die from shock or blood loss during the hours-long carry to aid stations. In Vietnam, the urgent whop-whop-whop of incoming Hueys meant survival. Medics worked under wheezing rotor noise with morphine syrettes, field dressings, and desperate prayers, stabilizing casualties in mud-smeared cabins while pilots flew instrument approaches through monsoon weather and sporadic fire. The survival rate for soldiers who reached surgical care alive approached 98%. But survival created its own mathematics of horror. Men lived through wounds that would have killed them in previous wars. Catastrophic limb damage, abdominal trauma, burns covering half their bodies. They survived to face months or years of rehabilitation, phantom pain, and psychological scars that had no medical classification in 1965. The helicopters saved lives, but they also guaranteed that more men would live with the permanent consequences of mechanized warfare. Back at Landing Zone X-Ray, the aftermath told a story that statistics couldn't capture. When the last PAVN assault was repulsed on November 17th and American forces began withdrawing by air, they left behind a battlefield that shocked even experienced soldiers. Craters from 500-pound bombs overlapped in the tree line. Spent brass casings carpeted foxholes ankle-deep. The red earth was churned into a moonscape of mud and blood, where men had fought hand-to-hand when ammunition ran low. Chaplains counted dog tags. The official American casualty count for the Ia Drang campaign, 234 killed, more than 250 wounded, represented the highest losses of any single engagement to that point in the war. For a nation just beginning major combat operations, the numbers were sobering. Television cameras captured flag-draped coffins arriving at Dover Air Force Base. Newspapers published photographs of young widows clutching folded flags. The War Department began confronting a public relations crisis that would only intensify. How do you justify losses when victory is measured in enemy body counts rather than captured territory? The PAVN losses were catastrophically worse. Some estimates exceeded 1,200 killed at Ia Drang, but they served different strategic objectives. Hanoi's leadership viewed casualties through the lens of revolutionary warfare. Attrition was acceptable if it demonstrated that American technology couldn't deliver quick victory. Every helicopter shot down, every medevac run under fire, every body bag returning to America proved that superior firepower had limits. The calculus was brutal but clear. Time favored whoever could endure. In the months following Ia Drang, both sides adapted. American doctrine embraced airmobile operations wholesale, not just for assault insertions, but for reconnaissance, artillery displacement, supply runs, and rapid reaction forces. The 1st Cavalry Division developed playbooks for vertical envelopment, using helicopters to insert blocking forces behind fleeing enemy units, turning retreats into encirclements. Commanders could react to intelligence in hours rather than days, concentrating overwhelming firepower before communist forces could disperse. The tempo was revolutionary, but the PAVN and Viet Cong adapted faster than American planners anticipated. Anti-aircraft weapons proliferated across communist-held territory. Not just small arms, but 12.7 millimeter and 14.5 millimeter heavy machine guns, captured Beaufort's guns, even recoilless rifles cited to deny helicopters easy approaches to landing zones. By mid-1966, pilots reported that cold LZs, supposedly undefended, were increasingly hot, with coordinated fire from multiple positions designed to create kill zones during the vulnerable seconds of landing and takeoff. The trees had eyes. The clearings had teeth. Night operations became particularly dangerous. Navigation was harder without visual references. Dust ingestion problems worsened when pilots couldn't see rotor wash effects. Enemy forces learned to wait for darkness, knowing that American advantages in air support and artillery coordination diminished without daylight observation. Many commanders therefore preferred dawn insertions despite exposure. Better to land in daylight and dig in than stumble into prepared positions at night. The tactical trade-offs grew increasingly complex. Small sensory details accumulated into cumulative psychological weight. Soldiers who flew multiple combat assaults spoke of the metallic grit that coated their lips after hot LZs, the way red laterite dust ground like sandpaper inside boots, the peculiar hollow feeling in the stomach when a helicopter banked hard to evade fire. They remembered the silence that fell over jungle clearings when rotorcraft approached. Birds and insects going quiet, as if nature itself held its breath. Then the mechanical crescendo of turbines and the high ping of spent brass hitting aluminum floors. The war became a collection of sense memories impossible to forget. Back at base camps like Camp Radcliffe and forward operating bases scattered across the Central Highlands, the logistics of air mobility consumed vast resources. Each Airmobile battalion required a continuous shuttle of supply helicopters and CH-47 Chinooks moving artillery rounds, water, rations, and ammunition when ground roads were impassable or too dangerous. The Chinooks, twin-rotor cargo workhorses, carried the heavy loads, howitzer tubes, resupply pallets, sometimes entire jeeps or bulldozers slung beneath their bellies. They were the invisible backbone of helicopter warfare. Maintenance consumed more man-hours than flight operations. Crews worked through monsoon nights under portable lights, replacing rotor heads damaged by overstress, cleaning carburetors clogged with laterite dust, patching bullet holes in hydraulic lines. The abrasive environment shortened engine life to fractions of peacetime norms. Transmissions that should have lasted thousands of hours needed rebuilding after hundreds. The machines were being consumed by the war as surely as the fuel they burned. Some nights, mechanics outnumbered pilots. For Vietnamese civilians caught in Airmobile operations zones, the helicopters brought terror as much as tactical change. Villagers near active LZs fled into secondary jungle or rice barns before operations began. The building roar of approaching formations, giving them minutes to grab children and scatter. The smell of smoke from burned thatch and cooking fires often marked hasty evacuations. In towns like Pleiku, the sudden arrival of large helicopter formations halted market traffic and sent shopkeepers scrambling to protect goods from rotor wash that could overturn vendor carts and scatter merchandise across muddy streets. What would you do if the sky itself became a battlefield overhead? Knowing that staying visible meant potential death, but hiding made you suspect. The moral complexity of helicopter warfare extended beyond combat. Pilots and crews developed superstitions and rituals to cope with repeated exposure to violence. Some wouldn't fly without specific medallions or photographs. Others had elaborate pre-flight routines, checking the same instruments in the same order, tapping specific gauges 3 times, always boarding from the same side. Crew chiefs who rinsed blood from cabin floors after medevac runs spoke of nightmares where they couldn't get the red stains out, where the smell of copper and aviation fuel merged into a single sensory memory that triggered panic in unexpected moments. The psychological cost had no line item in logistics reports. By late 1966, the patterns were clear. American forces could dominate any battlefield where helicopters could operate: open terrain, clearings, river valleys. But in dense jungle, urban areas, or mountains where landing zones were scarce, the tactical advantage diminished. Communist forces learned to fight where helicopters couldn't easily reach, to disperse before airmobile reactions could trap them, to accept that they'd lose conventional battles while winning the war of attrition. Helicopters changed how battles were fought. They didn't change who won the war. The machines kept flying. Tens of thousands of combat sorties logged, millions of pounds of supplies delivered, hundreds of thousands of troops inserted and extracted. The statistics were staggering. At war's peak, more than 7,000 Hueys operated in Vietnam, generating sortie rates that would have been impossible for any previous conflict. A single Airmobile battalion could launch dozens of sorties daily during heavy operations, moving companies like chess pieces across the board. But chess pieces bled. Joe Galloway, the UPI reporter who'd survived Ia Drang, later wrote of images that haunted him for decades. Men lying where they'd fallen, half buried by red earth. The peculiar stillness of bodies after combat. The way dust settled on everything. Weapons, faces, blood. Until it all turned the same rust color. He couldn't sleep for nights after returning from the field. The sensory memories too vivid to shut down through willpower alone. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a witness. But witness was enough to carry the weight. By 1968, the Tet Offensive shattered any remaining illusions about helicopter invincibility. Communist forces attacked over 100 cities simultaneously, including Saigon itself, demonstrating that air mobility couldn't prevent strategic surprise or defend everywhere at once. The helicopters that had seemed to promise quick victory had delivered something else entirely: endless tactical wins without strategic resolution. The fundamental paradox of helicopter warfare became clear through accumulated experience. American forces could dominate any piece of ground within helicopter range, could insert blocking forces, concentrate artillery, extract before enemy reinforcements arrived. But Vietnam had tens of thousands of square kilometers of jungle, mountains, and coastal plains. The helicopters could be anywhere, which meant they were never everywhere. Communist forces simply waited, dispersed, and struck where the helicopters weren't. Air mobility created tempo without achieving decision. The PAV and Viet Cong adapted with methodical precision. By war's middle years, anti-aircraft defenses were integrated into operational planning from the start. Trail watchers noted helicopter flight, paths, and radioed ahead. Heavy machine guns were pre-positioned along likely approach routes. Landing zones were surveyed and booby-trapped months before they might be used. The initial shock of vertical envelopment, which had paralyzed communist commanders at Ia Drang, became manageable through preparation and acceptance of inevitable losses. They learned to fight helicopter warfare by refusing to fight helicopter battles. The human cost accumulated in ways that transcended body counts. American pilots who survived multiple tours spoke of hypervigilance that never shut off, the constant scanning for muzzle flashes, the involuntary flinch at sudden sounds decades after returning home, the way certain smells could trigger complete sensory recall of combat. Crew chiefs who'd loaded and unloaded thousands of casualties developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Though in the late 1960s, the military simply called it combat fatigue and expected men to function through it. The machines could be repaired. The mines took longer. For Vietnamese forces, the psychological impact cut differently. The initial mockery of American helicopters, the propaganda dismissing them as expensive toys, gave way to grudging respect and tactical adaptation. Veterans of fights against air cavalry units described a specific kind of terror, knowing the enemy could arrive from any direction at any moment, that open ground meant death from above, that American artillery was never more than minutes away once helicopters spotted you. The jungle canopy became salvation. Tunnels became survival. Dispersal became doctrine. The war became three-dimensional. But the lasting transformation occurred not in tactics, but in strategic understanding. American military leadership gradually confronted an uncomfortable truth. Technological superiority created battlefield dominance without producing political victory. The helicopters could win every engagement and still lose the war. North Vietnamese leadership, conversely, learned they could lose every conventional battle and still win through endurance. The calculus that American public opinion would crack before communist resolve proved tragically accurate. Ia Drang's lessons ran both directions. By 1970, American withdrawal was underway. The Airmobile divisions that had revolutionized warfare began standing down, their helicopters transferred to South Vietnamese forces or shipped home. The statistics told the story of a doctrinal revolution. Over 16,000 UH-1 helicopters produced for the war effort, 2,500 lost to combat and accidents, millions of troops moved, hundreds of thousands of wounded evacuated. The machines had performed beyond any peacetime projection. They just couldn't win an unwinnable war. The final helicopter evacuations from Saigon in April 1975 provided bitter bookends to the air mobility experiment. Hueys lifted, desperate refugees from rooftops while PAVN tanks rolled through streets below, the ultimate image of helicopter warfare's limits. The machines that had promised to deliver quick victory instead delivered final retreat. Not because the technology failed, but because technology alone couldn't resolve political and social contradictions that transcended tactical mobility. Some problems can't be solved from the air. The legacy, however, extended far beyond Vietnam's borders. Every modern military doctrine of rapid deployment, every special operations insertion, every combat search and rescue mission traces lineage to the air cavalry experiments of 1965. The helicopter became central to military planning worldwide, not because it guaranteed victory, but because it fundamentally changed what was tactically possible. Modern conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond all relied on helicopter mobility pioneered in Vietnamese jungles. The doctrine survived even when the cause didn't. Veterans of the air cavalry carried their experiences forward in unexpected ways. Some became airline pilots, translating combat skills into civilian careers. Others taught at military academies, distilling hard lessons into doctrine. Many simply tried to forget, though the sensory memories, dust and blood and turbine roar, resisted erasure. At reunions decades later, they gathered not to celebrate victory, but to honor survival and remember those who didn't make it home. The bond was forged in rotor wash. For Vietnamese veterans, the helicopters became symbols of American power's ultimate futility. They'd faced the most advanced military technology of their era and survived through tactical adaptation and strategic patience. The machines were fearsome but not invincible. The soldiers flying them were skilled but not superhuman. And most importantly, technological advantage couldn't substitute for political will or compensate for fighting a war whose fundamental premises were flawed. They outlasted the helicopters. The numbers from Vietnam tell a story that transcends simple victory or defeat. 2,500 helicopters lost from roughly 12,000 that served in country, a 20% attrition rate. Over 2.4 million Americans served in Vietnam. 58,000 died. 300,000 were wounded. The helicopters saved countless lives through rapid medevac while delivering troops into situations that cost countless more. The machines were tools, sophisticated, expensive, revolutionary, but ultimately subject to the strategic and political constraints that govern the war itself. Technology doesn't determine outcomes. Context does. In the decades since, military historians have debated Ia Drang's significance. Some view it as proof that Airmobile doctrine worked, that American forces dominated the battlefield through superior mobility and firepower. Others see it as the first clear warning that tactical victories wouldn't translate to strategic success. Both interpretations carry truth. The helicopter revolutionized warfare while failing to deliver the quick victory its advocates promised. The paradox defines its legacy. Today, UH-1 helicopters sit in museums and memorial parks across America, silent, grounded, their turbines cold. Veterans bring grandchildren to touch the aluminum skin and explain what it meant to fly into hot landing zones. The machines that once dominated Vietnamese skies now teach history lessons about the limits of technological solutions to political problems. They changed warfare forever. They couldn't change the outcome. The young PAVN lieutenant, who'd smiled at the sound of approaching helicopters that November morning in 1965, eventually rose to senior command in unified Vietnam. In interviews decades later, he acknowledged that the initial contempt was foolish, that American air mobility was tactically brilliant, that facing helicopter assault was terrifying. But he also noted that terror could be endured, that tactics could adapt, and that strategic patience ultimately mattered more than tactical innovation. The helicopters were impressive. They just weren't enough. The final lesson of air cavalry warfare emerged not from any single battle, but from the accumulated weight of the entire conflict. Mobility, firepower, and technological superiority can dominate battlefields without winning wars. The ability to be anywhere quickly is powerful but not decisive if the enemy simply refuses to provide decisive targets. And revolutionary military technology, no matter how impressive, cannot compensate for unclear objectives, insufficient political will, or fundamental misunderstanding of the conflict's nature. The helicopters did exactly what they were designed to do. The war demanded something else entirely. As the rotors fell silent and the last air cavalry units returned home, they left behind a tactical revolution and a strategic lesson. Vietnamese troops were indeed stunned by America's helicopter warfare, shocked by its speed, overwhelmed by its firepower, transformed by its operational reach. But being stunned isn't the same as being defeated. And in the gap between tactical dominance and strategic victory, the entire rationale for the war eventually collapsed. The sky became a battlefield, but the war was won on the ground.